Thank you for listening to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. Sign up to our Patreon to receive bonus content, live streams, and our weekly newsletter with money off books and museum visits as well, plus early access to all live show tickets. That's patreon.com/wehaveways.
This episode is brought to you by KPMG. At KPMG, innovation is the go-to state of mind. Their visionary thinkers and advanced technology help you see beyond the now, uncover new insights, and turn them into opportunities. KPMG can help you leverage the value of data and drive transformational outcomes through innovation. To explore their thinking, go to kpmg.us.
Crypto is like the financial system, but different. It doesn't care where you come from, what you look like, your credit score, or your outrageous food delivery habits. Crypto is finance for everyone, everywhere, all the time. Visit kraken.com/see-what-crypto-can-be to learn more. Not investment advice. Crypto trading involves risk of loss. Cryptocurrency services are provided to U.S. and U.S. territory customers by Payward Ventures, Inc. View PBI's disclosures at kraken.com/legal/disclosures.
Alarm, alarm. Welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk with me, Al Murray and James Holland, your Second World War podcast for all your Second World War podcast needs. Now, Jim, we're joined by a very, very special guest today. So special to the point you've actually, rather than your usual busking, you've written an introduction.
I just have to, because the list of his achievements is long and is worth reading out, albeit still in very brief form. Just because he is, I have to say, I'm going to embarrass him here, one of the kind of most remarkable people I've ever met, it has to be said. So he's a former U.S. Marine, decorated multiple times for his part in the Vietnam War. He's got the Navy Cross, Silver Cross, Bronze Star to his name, obviously none of which are given out lightly, and a Purple Heart to boot. Later, he moved into politics, became Secretary of the Navy in the Reagan administration, also Assistant Secretary of Defense for Reserve Affairs, was twice asked by President Obama to be his running mate. Wow. And I don't mean jogging, I mean as in president. He was Democratic Senator for Virginia, took a shot at running for the presidency himself as a Democrat candidate in 2015. And he's also taught literature at the U.S. Naval Academy, was fellow at the Harvard Institute of Politics, and is now the first ever distinguished fellow of the University of Notre Dame's International Security Center. And as if that's not enough, he's also an Emmy Award-winning journalist, filmmaker, and author. And for my money, his Vietnam novel, Fields of Fire, is one of the best ever written about the conflict. And for those listening who are interested in the Pacific, Philippines, Yamashita, and MacArthur, and I'm assuming that you all are, I can highly, highly recommend his novel, The Emperor's General, which is how we first met, because back in my PR days, I was lucky enough to do the PR for him, and Jim came over, and we went around the country sort of promoting and around London and whatnot. And The Emperor's General is just a absolutely stupendously good novel. So anyway, so welcome, Jim Webb. It's great to have you on at long last.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you, and I hope we can make some news in terms of how the Marine Corps operates then and now, and those sorts of things, and just have a basic conversation from you and I were talking about earlier that probably focused on that period, interwar period between World War I and then into World War II for the Marine Corps. But I should say this: we are recording on November the 7th, and on November the 10th, 3 days from now, is the biggest day of the year for all Marines worldwide. Even more so than Veterans Day, which is November 11th, which I know in the UK is usually called Armistice Day. But 248 years ago, on November the 10th, the United States Marine Corps was formed in a tavern in Philadelphia, Tun Tavern. And from that time, literally, you'd be surprised. It's one of the things that really stunned me when I was a young, late teenager, but a young guy when I started affiliating with the Marine Corps, about how seriously the Marines take their own history. And, November the 10th, you'll find Marine Corps balls. The Marines hymn will be sung. It has a lot of historical things that the Marines did early on in their formation. And you'll find people my age calling up and emailing fellow Marines they've served with or whatever, saying happy birthday. So this is a great
Really, that's
to be
amazing.
talking about it. Oh yeah, it's really something, and it's just shows. My theory for my entire life, I grew up in the military, is that the great military organizations remember their traditions, and they force into the people who come in to join them that they are accountable to the things that those who went before them did. And it's a very big part of what the United States Marine Corps is. So if we're even going to discuss principally this period from World War I into World War II, I think it's useful just to sort of describe a little bit about the character of the Marine Corps and the history that was leading up to World War I and then thereafter, because it did change in its character and the size of the obligations that the Marine Corps took.
I mean, what was the original intention in forming them because it's during the Revolutionary War, isn't it?
That was the formation of the Continental Marines. I think the Marine Corps probably early on was the sort of the ugly adopted stepchild of the Royal Marines.
Right.
And they've had an affinity with the Royal Marines even to this day. But the early Marine Corps, up until World War I think is the best way to put it, was basically we were the soldiers of the sea, traditionally, the soldiers of the sea, on the ships and off the ships. They became known early on for marksmanship, for high levels of discipline with their Marines, and also with the importance of small unit leadership. It just wasn't large divisions marching across the continent formed the character and the reputation of the Marine Corps. There were snipers up in the mast of the sailing ships. There were landing parties, which I think, having been a rifle platoon commander and then a company commander, fairly small unit, particularly rifle platoon commander, the importance of absolute strength in the leadership of the small leadership, but they were the landing party, snipers from the mast. Importantly, as this goes on, it's the idea that even in your uniform in the Marine Corps, you are showing respect for the Marines who've gone before you. If you look at a Marine Corps uniform carefully, even these days, you'll see for an officer on the top of what they call the garrison cap, there's a quatrefoil. The quatrefoil was what the snipers used to wear when they were up on the masts of the ship. It's sort of sewn in. They have high collars because of the leather collars that the shipboard Marines would use when they were up in the mast and exposed, and that's why they started calling the Marines leathernecks early on. Yeah, and there are red stripes on the trousers of all Marines who reach the rank of corporal, which is the lowest level of NCO. And the red, they tell you, was to remember the blood that was shed at Chapultepec during the Mexican War, where the Marines, when these small landing party sizes moved in, and they lost 11 Marines killed in Chapultepec. They have the eagle, globe, and anchor on their collars. That became the symbol. The globe meaning they go anywhere. The anchor that they were soldiers of the sea, and the eagle that they would literally fight anywhere. They became known, and still are, as the few, the proud. The interesting thing, though, was that up until the time of World War I, they never really took the kinds of casualties that a lot of the other units, there was, fighting units around the world and in the United States. I just kind of looked this up several years ago because I was trying to figure out, all of these things that we remembered, like the Boxer Rebellion, but they were big in China in the Boxer Rebellion, et cetera, et cetera. But if you add up all of the actual battle killed in actions to the point of World War I, there were only 330 Marines who had been killed in action in all the country's wars. Yeah, all the country's wars, add them up. There were very small units, 2,000 total Marines most of the time. And then in World War I, you really saw a change, and that was in 1917 when the United States entered World War I. Due to the leadership of John Lejeune, who was one of the great commandants. I think he was commandant for like 9 years, and very, very smart about the future of the Marines, that sort of thing. They formed for the first time 2 actual fighting regiments, regimental size, and sent them over into France. The 5th Marine Regiment, I fought in the 5th Marine Regiment in Vietnam, and the 6th Marine Regiment, and my son fought at the 6th Marine Regiment in Iraq. But both very famous regiments, one the 1st Marine Division, the other the 2nd Marine Division. And in World War I, they proved themselves in large-scale fighting. The Germans nicknamed them the Devil Dogs. The Battle of Belleau Wood, a very famous battle, etc. And a lot of it was discipline, marksmanship, and leadership, the same sort of things that had built, the Marine Corps at a smaller scale. And when that ended, and so we're going to kind of get into now what we were talking about with the development of amphibious warfare and some other things. The Marine Corps saw that it could have a role doing 2 things. One was to be the little larger scale fighting unit that could go anywhere on a moment's notice, short even later of nuclear war, in a total homogeneous package, have every component of a fighting unit, including air support, close air support, inside the Marine Corps. And looking after the end of the World War I into the early 1920s and looking into the Pacific rather than to the amount of time that had been spent in the Atlantic and in Europe in World War I, they were saying, what's going to happen? The Marine Corps and also the Navy leadership too. What are we going to do here? What's the real threat? Because the United States had opened up a larger scale presence in the Philippines after the Spanish-American War.
Right from the word go in the 1920s, it appeared to the U.S. Marine Corps and the U.S. Navy that Japan and the Pacific and the Far East was where the biggest threat lay.
Well, I think on not necessarily the bigger threat per se, but in terms of naval warfare and, looking at an expansionist Japan, and it was, Japan was really on the move after World War I, actually well before World War I, after the Meiji Restoration, when Japan opened up to the outside, it became the number 1 power in East Asia, as opposed to China. The Qing dynasty had fallen apart, and Russia, which had tried, and the Japans beat them badly in the Russo-Japanese War. So they looked out there and they said, okay, the naval leaders, and particularly a Marine named Pete Ellis, who I'd like to talk about a little bit at some point here, they were saying that the Japanese had moved into islands. This sounds a little bit like what we see in the South China Sea now with China, but the Japanese had taken control over islands in the Central Pacific. And the Japanese actually had at one point wanted to annex Hawaii before we annexed Hawaii in the late 1800s. So they looked at that and they saw the militarizations, and they said, okay, if we have to fight something in Japan or even in anywhere else in East Asia, how would we get through these Japanese defensive fortifications in the Central Pacific? And the Navy put together what was called War Plan Orange, which was it was an early just sort of look at how would we do this? How would we as a naval service get through what the Japanese are doing? And actually, the Germans at one point had annexed some islands in Micronesia as well. And so they were looking at the Germans, the Japanese, et cetera. And then this War Plan Orange, the Marine Corps started looking at it very carefully. And they started focusing on how do you do, when we're talking blunt amphibious force exercises, large scale for the Marine Corps, division size, 2 division size at some points, more. how do we do this? We'd have to do it during the daylight because of the islands and the topographies and the tides, et cetera. But how do we do it? And what are the components that we have to solve? There's a really interesting former Marine named Pete Ellis, who's a legend inside the thinking Marine Corps, even today. Pete Ellis was a Midwest guy. He's from Kansas, but he enlisted in the Marine Corps, and he was over in the Philippines at one point. After the Spanish-American War and the Philippines insurrection, and he was like this really quiet, really smart madman. Brain never stopped working. And there was a story about Pete Ellis as a fairly young officer in the Philippines, where they were out in this camp, in the muck and the mire and all the rest of that. And I'll tell you, I've spent a lot of time in that part of Asia, the Guam, Tinian, and the Philippines, et cetera. And the cockroaches are huge. They're like as big as a mouse. I remember being in this little 4-room so-called hotel in Tinian when I was doing a research thing for the governor of Guam when I was 27 years old. And I'm sitting in my bed, and the door, at the bottom of the door doesn't close all the way, and these cockroaches started crawling in under the door. And I mean, they were big. Pete Ellis is sitting there with this guy who'd come in from Washington to talk about something or another. And the guy started complaining about the cockroaches on the table. And Pete Ellis just took out his pistol and shot him off the table. Every Marine I know thinks that was very cool, and then he started thinking during World War II. He served in World War II in Europe, but even before he deployed, he started looking, as did some others, at the flawed invasion of Gallipoli, and why did it fail? What were the components that caused it to fail? These were brave soldiers, they went up against a hard enemy, but why? And Ellis started looking at it. The Marine Corps started breaking down the components of Gallipoli. What were the things that were wrong in just the logistic sense? When you think about it, when I was 17 years old, that I started, my military participation when I was in college. They would make us, if we were Marine options, they would make us study the Battle of Gallipoli in the mid-1960s. And break it down. And the fascinating thing was the logistical side. The logical logistics of how you do these things. There's an old saying that amateurs talk strategy and professionals talk logistics. You can get there, but if you don't have the beans, the bullets, and the band-aids, you're going to get killed. And there was just a simple concept like reverse combat loading. When they packed the ships to go to Gallipoli, they didn't. The last goes first, the first goes last. If you know what I mean. When you pull up to the landing site, the first stuff off is the first thing they need, but which should have been the last things that you loaded. It just small things like that. That really got the Marine Corps thinking. The Marine Corps is famous for innovators. They'll look at something, a lot of the reasons being because they're small, and a lot because people are always trying to do away with the Marine Corps, which they did after World War II. They tried very hard to do away with the Marine Corps. Harry Truman was an Army Guard guy and served in World War I and really didn't like the Marine Corps. And the Army generals were saying the Marine Corps is a bunch of foul-mouthed, sloppy guys who think they're like to be soldiers or something. How this goes back and forth. But then Pete Ellis sat down when this War Plan Orange was being discussed in the higher levels. He was General DeJean really liked him. He was probably in his early 30s by then, maybe mid-30s. But he sat down and he said, "Okay, we're going to fight Japan." This was 1921 when he laid it out. He said, "We're going to fight them, and this is how we're going to fight them." And he sat down in a room in the headquarters of the Marine Corps in Washington, pulled out all the tide, the times of the tides, the terrain, et cetera, and laid out what he called Operation Plan 712. And I read that when I was spending time in in the Mariana Islands after I had left the Marine Corps, trying to figure out how the United States was going to reconfigure it. I went over there and I read Pete Ellis's Op Plan 712 back in the Marine Corps historical section. He'd never been there. He'd never been out in the Central Pacific, but he got it right. The tides, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, and he became so obsessed with this that the Commandant of the Marine Corps gave him what we might call, what do you call when the professor gets his year off? A sabbatical. They brought Ellis in. He put on a civilian suit. He gave them a letter of resignation to keep in their desk in case anything ever happened to him. And he just headed off to the Central Pacific to do a physical recon of all these islands. And he was, the Japanese, after a while, they'd see this, this American saying he was a businessman or something, sitting out in a boat, taking notes on where their, landing sites might be. And the Japanese get really nervous with him. And in January of 1923, he'd been out there a year and a half or so doing this. He was over in Palau, which is all the way through to the west, where the Battle of Peleliu was.
Yeah. It's the biggest island, isn't it? Palau of the
Peleliu
Palau Island.
It's a Palauan island. Peleliu was the battle.
It is one of the Palauans. Yeah.
Yes, it's in Palau, and it actually, Battle of Peleliu, according to Liddell Hart, was the bloodiest single division battle of World War II in any front. The 1st Marine Division went into Peleliu, and it was really, really bad. So Pete Ellis is out there in a boat in Palau, and the Japanese pulled him ashore, and he somehow died. Nobody knew how he died. The embassy in Tokyo, at the time, American embassy, sent a sailor down to pick up his remains. They had cremated his remains and came back, and he was like so shook he couldn't talk about it. And then you had the Great Kanto earthquake, 1923 in Tokyo. It was 140,000 Japanese died in this huge and fast earthquake. And this Navy sailor was in a hospital, and he died. So nobody knows how Pete Ellis died or what the Japanese did to this guy when he was down there.
That's an amazing story.
Yeah, it's a great story. I heard it first when I was like 25 years old from a guy named Clay Barrow, who was a real military historian over the former first sergeant who was at Naval Institute. So anyway, after all that, the Marine Corps in World War II really had taken the lead on amphibious doctrine, and particularly on shock amphibious and large size shock amphibious operations. And you can just go through these, thinking about these battles that these Marines fought head on, daytime. The Guadalcanal landings, which they stayed for quite a while. Yeah. Guadalcanal, Bougainville, Tulagi, Tarawa, Kwajalein, Eniwetok, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. At the end of that, in the 1930s, the entire Marine Corps was 22,000 people. At the end of World War, they obviously expanded in World War II, but at the end of World War II, 20,000 American Marines were dead. 91,000 total casualties. The few, the proud, the Marines. We're going to celebrate it again or remember it again on Friday.
Absolutely amazing, fascinating that Ellis is out there doing this scouting around and comes to this mysterious end. It's amazing. And do they send anyone else after that, or do they think that he's done enough? And
I think probably my guess to that, I've never really thought of it in those terms, was Pete Ellis was one guy, and he was probably really irritating to them since he popped up on these different islands, and he's gone. lot of other things to do.
So the Marine Corps is plugged into this intellectual effort to try and figure out what's coming next. Because the Army famously, there are people like George Patton who are dreaming of having tank armies and all that sort of thing. So to what extent are they able to once they've started to define this doctrine, to do exercises or tactical exercises without troops, or tutes, as they're called here, that sort of thing? Is that what they're doing? Are they running sort of exercises and stuff, or have they got any kit at all? How are they keeping this sort of body of ideas alive in the interwar period? So after
they were developing this in the interwar period, sort of from its infancy. We do know that the other services and other armies ended up having amphibious landings, and they stumbled through. They stumbled through in different ways. This was it was a fresh concept. The point really here is, I'll say something about other amphibious landings other than the Marine Corps in a minute here, but the thing that the Marine Corps has been famous for is innovation, amphibious warfare, helicopter doctrine.
Yeah.
The Marines were the first to come out there with helicopter doctrine during the Korean War. How do you get medevacs in? How do you bring troops in? They developed the doctrine, and then the Army moved it forward. And a lot of that was budgetary for the Marine Corps. They had a big fight first trying to do away with the Marine Corps in the 48-50 period, and the Battle of Incheon, the landing at Incheon, saved the Marine Corps. MacArthur signed away his total career by betting on the Marine Corps going into Incheon. 12-foot tide levels moving back and forth. These people, they were World War II veterans, so many of them, and picked up. In 6 weeks, they reported back in, got on the ships, landed at Incheon, the most brilliant maneuver, warfare exercise, I think, in American history, and close air support. The idea that you should have fixed wing aircraft and tactical operations that is highly trained with you, which is what the Marine Corps did. In 1957, there was a attempt to downsize the Marine Corps, to have the Marine Corps give up its fixed wing aircraft. They had to make a decision between losing their fixed wing aircraft, there's no other service that had fixed wing aircraft. If the Army wanted, they had to call up the Air Force. You don't train together, etc. When I was in Vietnam, I could call an A4 150 meters in front of me to drop 250 pound bombs. But they had to trade off, and they traded off. They kept their fixed wing, and the Army got the air mobile doctrine. But the doctrine had first begun with the experiments that the Marine Corps had done. And so that's what was going on before World War II. Now, and on the other hand, the largest amphibious invasion of World War II, Sicily. People tend to think it was Normandy. Yeah. But you had Sicily, you had Normandy. Those were not Marine Corps operations. And our Army stumbled learning at the beginning of the World War II on amphibious doctrine. If you look at the North African invasions, they decided they wanted to do that at night so that the enemy couldn't see them. And they lost a lot of soldiers stepping off of amphibious craft with all their gear on, and the amphibious craft wasn't where it should be, and they just
hit a sandbar or whatever off the front, or just completely gone awry. I mean, because navigating a Higgins boat or something is not particularly easy, because it's very easy to drift because you haven't got the keel and all that kind of stuff, and it's so you really need that visual eyes on the target of where you're trying to land, don't you?
The Marine Corps was not perfect, believe me, on this stuff. I mean, it's if you studied the Battle of Tarawa, when the Marines hit Tarawa, and I've been on Tarawa, I visited Tarawa, the great thing about being a writer, people say, "Why you're in government? Why do you want to write?" I say, "Because when you're a writer, you can get people to pay you to indulge your curiosities." So I've been to Tarawa, but Tarawa, they did the recon element for the landing, recon the raw island, the very small islands, and so when they came in on their amphibious landing in Tarawa, they were, we talk about the Higgins boat, James, that high pointed where they couldn't move forward, and the Marines, lost a lot of people getting to the shore. I know when my son, who as I said, later became a Marine. When he went and saw Saving Private Ryan, and they had the filmography there on D-Day, he goes, man, you got to see this. And I went and saw it with him. I went back and pulled the history books out, and I said, what you just saw was Tarawa. It wasn't Omaha Beach. I mean, the number of casualties on Omaha Beach were about the same as they were on Tarawa with just that little 2nd Marine Division. And but Tarawa was 72 hours of slaughter.
Just go back to Gallipoli, though. So the sort of combat loading, that's one lesson. Was there kind of anything else? I mean, because the Higgins boat for example, doesn't get trialed until May 1941. There's no program of assault craft until the kind of war begins. And really the big bulk of assault craft building in World War II happens between, from April 1942 until May 1943. Then there's a kind of then they sort of keep up the levels until the end of the war. But that's the big surge of assault craft building. And that's when you get your kind of landing ships and landing craft tanks and all this kind of stuff. In the kind of, when they're thinking about it between the wars, they're assuming, in any fight against Japan, you're going to have to do this kind of island stuff. So how are they going to land? I mean, what's the thinking?
Well, first of all, the size of the Marine Corps during the 1930s was back down to about 22,000 Marines total. The systems, the weapon systems, the landing systems that you're talking about really a lot of that had been pioneered. The Marine Corps had an area I think it was at Camp Pendleton, off of Camp Pendleton, where they were really experimenting with amphibious landings, amphibious assault. What do you need, and these sorts of things. But with respect to something like Gallipoli, I would think that one of the things that they pulled from this is the need to have, for lack of a term, bombardment. Before you land, you need to have a high level of suppressive fire, in naval guns, and and like in World War II, they had a lot of tanks that would come in at the same time as the landing craft went in. Saipan was a really good example of that. Battle of Saipan. I think there is still a Marine tank in the water, just on the other side of the reef, in front of the landing place where the Marines landed on Saipan in 1944. But getting that kind of really heavy fire,
But kind of World War II relics around the Pacific is, it's quite a thing, isn't it? I mean, I remember being on Guadalcanal and seeing, and they've got you can still see the remnants of sort of Japanese assault craft on the beaches. There's not much left now. And then you sort of go into a little bit of sort of jungle clearing, and there's a sort of whole mass of collected bits of aircraft and lightnings. And
I spent a good bit of time, as I mentioned before, in the Mariana Islands. After I left the Marine Corps, I'd written a piece on the need to reshape our military basing system in the Pacific and to move into what would be called strategically an interior position along Guam and the Mariana Islands, Northern Marianas, which ironically they're doing now finally.
Right.
It's to some extent they're moving the Marines into Guam, and Tinian was a great place.
Oh, they're back. I knew they're back on. They're on Guam at the moment, aren't they? But are they? So the U.S. Marines are currently moving back into the Pacific.
They're moving from in that area. They're moving from. They've been in Okinawa. The 3rd Marine Division has been in Okinawa for a long time, and they've been as a not simply because of the Japanese defense, but as a place where they can as a maneuver place where they can get into any of these other areas if they have to go quickly, and on board ship, out of the Okinawa thing. But I think the people of Okinawa have been very patient for a lot of years, with the size of the American basing system. A lot of it works to their benefit economically and otherwise on Okinawa, but it's a lot. So they want to downsize our footprint in Okinawa, and the rest of Japan exactly thrilled about having another base, in their, areas. Japan's highly densely populated in the areas where they're, because they got mountains, a spine of mountains right through the middle of the islands there. But so they're moving Marines from there down into Guam. I had recommended that they put like a regiment out there on Tinian. There's nothing on Tinian. But the point is, when you're talking about the World War II relics, is Saipan, the island of Saipan, they had done after the battle was over and the war was over, they did one EOD sweep of the northern part of Saipan, and that was it. And they around in 72, I think, they finally lifted the barriers. The word was that there was a CIA training base for nationalist Chinese special force types. And I can't confirm that 100%, but there were some activities up there, but not much. But when they opened that up in 1972, and I was over there 73, 74, and I got the big aerial maps and put the data on day by day, the Battle of Saipan, 2nd Marine Division on one side, 4th Marine Division on the other side, and that Army National Guard division in the middle, and marked it all out and went out there and visited. And I found fighting positions that were still in place, boot heels,
really,
K rations, caves. I have in my.
So when was this, Jim? What year was this?
This was 74 when I did the full walkthrough on my own. And and up in the north, when the way that the Japanese were fighting, they fought to the last person. They believed they had stained their family if they surrendered. So and they were in the Marines were digging them out of caves in the northern part of the island when they first started this move forward. Lost a lot of them. No, it's 3,600 Americans dead just in that little island, a 30 square mile island. But up in the north, they just stopped going into the caves. They just blew them shut, blow them shut, or put a flamethrower in there, try to get them out. And some of these caves started opening up in the early 70s, and they were allowing Japanese to go in, to try to recover bones to give them a proper Shinto burial and that sort of thing. But I found one cave. I was following the battles where I knew that the Marine tanks could only go so far, and then they would lose their topography. And I was following that, and I got in this little gully, and I said, the Japanese were going to put positions up this gully with a little stream in there going up top of this hill. That's where they put them, because they would think the Marines were going to come down that gully toward the north of the thing. And I got up there, and there was 2 fighting positions right up there inside rice bottles, that sort of thing. And then there was a big cave, like a 3-room cave behind it. And I got in there. There were boots in there. I picked one up. I dropped it, and it just fell apart. I brought back stuff I'll show you if you ever get to my writing office here. I've got the bottles and sulfur morphine vials out of there, that kind of stuff. So it was like, wow, it's like nobody had.
Yeah. It's like just sort of frozen in time.
45, at that time, So.
And obviously that's just after you've come back from Vietnam. So, you've got lots of combat experience yourself. So clearly you're able to bring that experience to bear in what you're looking at, and you're able to sort of context it, sort of interpret it, I suppose.
If you've been through the type of war that we fought, or I was in Vietnam, and then you go to a place like Saipan, there's a lot of similarities, tactical similarities, although the area that I fought in was also a heavily built up population. Anyway, but so you could walk in there and knowing, having experienced this, you just feel where these things were. And of course, I'm doing this all my life too, in terms of military histories.
Jim, one thing is why is it that the U.S. Marine Corps never sees action in Europe? Is that just because the Pacific campaign is a U.S. Navy dominated campaign? I mean, and the U.S. Marine Corps part of the U.S. Navy. I mean, there used to be a joke when I was waiting. I was in the Naval Academy, and I was waiting to go to Vietnam. I knew I was going to go, but there was a saying in the Marine Corps: we train to fight in Europe, and we die in Asia.
we did fight in World War I there, but I think when I was Assistant Secretary of Defense for 3 years, I had NATO as one of my NATO Europe mobilization to evaluate our mobilizations, not in terms of the tactics, that was the uniform side, but in terms of the resources. Can they do it, et cetera, et cetera. And I worked a lot with our NATO allies, particularly the German army. I spent a lot of time with. I also got to go on, there was an operation called Operation Lionheart. It's either 84, 85. It was the first time that they replicated the D-Day sort of invasion from the UK into the landmass of Europe and went on a NATO operation. I went with them on that and observed that.
It's 85 or 86, yeah, and it was a full scale, British Army on the Rhine mobilization and everything into Europe, the full shebang.
I went with them on that. I went with the Brits over as an observer when I was Assistant Secretary of Defense.
Yeah.
But the style of warfare in NATO Europe with the Soviets was much better matched by the United States Army, and the mobility and we could go. I mean, with the Marine Corps, they could go. The thing the Brits always have been able to do they can go on 24 hours notice anywhere and fight anybody under anything less than nuclear. And that's the whole thing about what I was talking about with close air support and this sort of. They had a whole homogeneous package that this most recent former commandant has seriously damaged. And I hope this new commandant can get them back on that, because that's always been the value of the Marine Corps.
Well, the speed of maneuver and the speed of being able to, that kind of versatility.
And the homogeneity of the entire tactical need.
It's sort of like a deep battle concept that you have everything all in one package together.
You can go, and you're ready to go. And, with the Army, traditionally, the Army has to coordinate for like close air with Air Force. They don't train together. They haven't trained together, but it's all there in the Marine Corps. My dad was in the Air Force, and he was a bomber pilot in World War II, flew in the Berlin airlift, et cetera. And when he found out I wanted to go in the Marine Corps, he just couldn't stand the thought that I was going to do this, and he would say, why is there even a Marine Corps? and I would go, why is there an Air Force? The Marine Corps has an Air Force. The Army has an Air Force. The Navy has an Air Force. What are you doing? But, I went and then my brother went. My brother was a Huey pilot. And by then it was, I got my two Marines here, I got my infantry guy here, and I got my pilot here, so everything was like, okay, Dad, and by the way, we both finally joined the military.
It's interesting, though. In this country, I think there is a perception that the Marine Corps fought the war in the Pacific and that the U.S. Army were not involved at all. Would you agree with that, James? I mean,
yeah, I think so to a certain extent. And yes, it's always seen the sort of U.S. Army as a kind of Europe thing. John McManus always says, he always likes to point out that the U.S. Army had more men deployed than the Marine Corps by quite a substantial margin.
Well, they had far more men to deploy around the world than the Marine Corps.
Well, of course, that's the key point, isn't it? Is the Marine Corps is a small thing.
We'll fight each other over this, but it's I want credit where credit's due, and there are a lot of things that, as James, you'll know, the way that I tried to honestly examine Douglas MacArthur and give him his ups and his downs and that sort of thing. For all of the negatives that people like to throw at MacArthur, I think his campaign from Australia all the way up into the Philippines saved a lot of lives. Yeah. He was very smart the way that he was able to use his people and the concept of leaving them starving on the vine. You don't have to. There were a lot of land mass with the way that MacArthur brought his people up. Whereas in the Marine Corps, you got to blow a hole right through here. for naval predominance. You've got to get all these islands. They probably didn't have to invade Peleliu, but MacArthur made them do that. That was MacArthur, and that's the word was MacArthur said he wanted that flank covered when he reinvaded the Philippines. But I have a lot of respect for I'm a ground guy. I have a lot of respect for infantry folks that are in the Army too.
Well, how can one not when you look at all the campaigns that were fought in the Second World War, and not least in the Pacific as well. But as you point out, I mean, the U.S. Marine Corps is a much smaller entity, and still takes on an incredible weight of the combat in the Pacific. You think of all those island campaigns,
and it did,
starting out of Guadalcanal, of course. Which was I know it's finished by the Army.
The Marine Corps is very very proud of the fact that they're the first to fight. And they go the hardest places. And you can look at Vietnam. Our casualty rate in Vietnam was, very high, much higher than the other services. The rate was much higher. We sent 400,000 Marines into Vietnam. We had 103,000 killed or wounded. We had more total casualties than in World War II, although there were more killed in World War II. We had 14,490 Marines we lost in Vietnam. But we went to
103,000 in Vietnam.
103,000. Here's the official Marine Corps history. 103,000 killed or wounded, and it's this whole the small unit concept. In the First Division, the Marine Corps had the Third Division was up along the DMZ most of the time. They had very conventional battles and big battles. In the First Division, we fought populated areas, mountain areas, etc., but it was small unit context constantly. And we lost in Quang Nam province, of the 5 provinces where the Marine Corps fought. We lost a plurality of the kill in Quang Nam province. 7,000 died in Quang Nam province. So I had a great experience last year in this Notre Dame program, bringing the students in the Notre Dame's International Security Center into Vietnam. We did Hanoi. We did a windshield tour of a battle that I was in, or my regiment was in May of 1969, 8-day battle. I took them out there, and then they went down to Saigon. But taking them out there and showing them the terrain. We were all the way up against Laos. We're 12 miles from Laos, where we were. So yeah, but the Marines have always said we'll go do the hard things. I mean, but you look at Iraq. Everybody pulled a load in Iraq. My son was in Ramadi, during some bad fighting there. But a lot of those Army units, they were being rotated in too quickly. They weren't given enough time. I tried to get legislation passed on this when I was in the Senate, where traditionally you have, this may be a little bit off topic, but traditionally you have a 2-to-1 ratio when you're sending units into combat. For every year you're there, you get 2 years back to replenish, to retrain, get your brain straight. And the Army had pulled that down to like 15 months. You'd be over there a year, and then you went up to 15 months. You had like less time at home than you were having when they were sending them into the Baghdad area. They really paid a heavy price.
Wow.
Oh, emotionally heavy price long term.
Yeah, I'm sure. Well, Jim, we started off having a conversation about the U.S. Marine Corps in the interwar years, and ended up with a pretty broad brush sweep of yeah, exactly. But it's been fascinating. I mean, thank you so much for coming on. Really, really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been talking to indefatigable Jim Webb with his your CV alone, Jim. I'm going to tell people to go back to the start of the podcast and listen once again to that, because we talked to an awful lot of people on this podcast, but you're very much the real deal. And thank you for joining us.
Well, I appreciate it. I'm sorry if I took too much time myself. I'd be interested in this discussion.
No, we want to hear it from you. That's the whole point. Anyway, thanks for listening, everyone. Jim, thanks for coming on. See you next time. Cheerio.